Hey everybody, OperationZ here, and we're continuing Joseph's story. And we pick up where we leave off from part 4, and we're on part 5 now. And in part 4, we see everything that, just takes place with, the hatred and the jealousy that comes from all the brethren of Joseph, and we can understand why they're so mad and angry at Joseph, just because of all that extra love and attention and care and, you know, getting that coat of many collars, that elevated status, just that he was getting all this extra love and care and attention from his dad, and opposed to all the other brethren, that Joseph has. And, it pretty much it stirs up that strife and hatred and and again it's been over the years, but they get this idea when he comes along to Dothan where they relocated to for whatever reason, again probably just to get away from Joseph. But they relocate and they go to Dothan, and Joseph's there, and they see him, and they say, "Behold, this dreamer cometh." They're mocking at him because of these dreams that he's having, and they're pretty much just fed up with it because it's so elevated and exalted. Like, he's basically telling them his sheave is going to be standing upright and all their sheaves are going to bow to him, and then you have the other one with the sun and the moon and the 11 stars will pretty much worship Joseph. Not worship, but, they would bow and make reverence and so on. And of course, 11 stars would be 11 brethren, because he has 11 brothers. And then the sun and the moon, sun would be, as Jacob points out, sun would be his dad, the moon would be his mom. But, we just see that in the text that pretty much, pretty much just so elevated, so put higher up than all of them. And they're prophetic dreams from God that Joseph has that comes true, but it came off the wrong way for a few reasons with all of his brethren. Of course, because he's saying, basically that he's going to be in a superior position above all them, which, and again, it does all come true. But, we just see that here. And we're going to pick up where we left off in Genesis chapter 37. And we're on verse 25 now. And they sat down to eat bread, and they lifted up their eyes and looked, and behold, a company of Ishmaelites came from Gilead with their camels, bearing spicery and balm and myrrh, going to carry it down to Egypt. So, what we know from Abraham's story is the Ishmaelites, they derive from Ishmael. That name in the Hebrew basically meaning God listens, because of what happened with Hagar coming in the way, and she tried to get away, and then the angel told her, and then she said go back or the angel said to her, go back and pretty much go back to Abraham and Sarah, submit yourself to them, because you're going to have a son, and he's going to be a great and mighty nation, and you'll call his name Ishmael, which means God listens. And Ishmael and his mother Hagar, they pretty much go out, but Hagar takes him a wife out of Egypt, where she's from originally, and Ishmael has his wife, and then that's the start and the Genesis, just that start of the beginning of the Ishmaelite people, and that's where they come from. So they're Ishmaelite traders here, people known for trading and whatnot. And pretty much, these Ishmaelites, they see it as an opportunity that they happen to come across all of Joseph's brethren, and Joseph's there in that pit. So we're going to see what they do here in verse 26. Genesis chapter 37, verse 26 says this: And Judah said unto his brethren, What profit is it if we slay our brother and conceal his blood? Now, there's something very interesting here, and this is a real edification of faith type moment here with the Old Testament, which is why it's so important to read the Old Testament along with the New Testament, because when you do and you see these things in the Old Testament, it will build your faith because it's a foreshadowing. So Judah comes up with this idea to betray Joseph, right? And when they betray Joseph right here, when he does it, Judah, they do it for, right here, I believe it's 20 pieces of silver that they end up betraying him for. And it's Judah's idea. So later on, when Jesus is betrayed by, pretty much, because there's one disciple and one apostle for each tribe of Israel. That's why there's 12 of them. And Judas, which symbolizes Judah right here in this text, he betrays Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. And the same way that Jesus goes to be the Savior of the world, Joseph, in this smaller scale version, saves the East from, pretty much he saves them from starvation and, just dying of that in the midst of all this great famine that they have, and that's just kind of something, and again, we're kind of going ahead, but it's just a good opportunity here to make mention of just this foreshadowing, and how it goes to build our faith, because we see how it's congruent with the New Testament. So, it's just very important to take in and let your brain soak in the Old Testament, because you'll see everywhere how it points to Jesus. Like, it's all throughout this text here. But in Genesis chapter 37, verse 27, Come and let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother and our flesh. And his brethren were content. So basically, he says he's our brother. Let's not kill him, because that would be pretty much a rude jerk move type thing to do. So let's just take him, and he's just our brother. Let's go and sell him to these Ishmaelites, which end up taking him. We'll see, but basically, he's going in for slave labor, which is still a very cruel thing to do, and pretty much the, especially his brethren, it just shouldn't have been this way. But, we just see that pretty much we learn from that what they want to do, and then it's better than killing him, but it's still really bad, and it says here his brethren were content. It says, and his brethren were content. They were all consenting to take their brother and take these Ishmaelite traders, these men of Midian that came by, and he's pretty much saying, just go to these men, draw Joseph out of the pit, and take him and sell him to these Ishmaelite traders. And so Genesis chapter 37 verse 28, then there passed by Midianites merchantmen, and they drew and lifted up Joseph out of the pit, and sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver, and they brought Joseph into Egypt. So right here, that's the 20 pieces of silver. They took Joseph and sold him for, pretty much the 20 pieces of silver. And, that's the price of a human slave in those days, is the 20 pieces of silver. And, in Judas's case with Jesus, that's the price of blood. And, that's why when he throws that money at the temple, when he regrets what he did, pretty much they gather it up and they buy this field and they call it the field of blood. And, that's just something that's noteworthy here. But they take this 20 pieces of silver, like basically that's what the Ishmaelites pay Joseph's brethren for, and they just sell his brother to the hands of the Ishmaelites to go wherever, whatever. They don't care, they say. They just want to be rid of. Then his fate is literally in God's hands at that point. But Genesis chapter 37 verse 29, and Reuben returned unto the pit, and behold, Joseph was not in the pit, and he rent his clothes. So Reuben came back, and he saw what his brethren did, that they took him and sold him and did all this that they said that they were going to do when Reuben was absent. And we see pretty much that Reuben is grieved by it, so much so that he rent his clothes. Like whenever they would do that, that pretty much means they're taking their clothes and they're just literally ripping them up. It's an expression of, basically like mourning and regretfulness, or so on and so forth, like that they just rip them up, and he took his clothes and rent them. And like when we were going through the story of Jonah, when the king of Nineveh heard that, he rent his clothes and then he proclaimed a fast. It can go with fasting too, because it was like a mourning type situation, and the circumstances were that way. And pretty much, they do that, and then everybody pretty much goes on that fast, and it's just kind of like a custom that they had in that part of the world, and that's something that they would do. And like right here, Reuben, he tears his clothes up and he rents his clothes, as the scriptures say, because he knows how his father is going to be. He knows how much that Jacob loves Joseph. So Jacob is going to be mourning heavily, and that's what's going on Reuben's mind. And being older and more level-headed, he realizes more what actually happened than his brethren. Because he's older and more level-headed, and pretty much that's what's to take from this text here. And again, they're not even really that young or anything, because Joseph's the second to youngest, and he's 17 at this point when he is sold into slavery. And his brethren are, not too far apart. They're basically in their 20s and 30s and whatnot. But, we just see that Reuben, he has that more level-headedness and more of that just sense of right and wrong. And, he knew that most definitely should not be done, because their father loves him so much, and he's grieved about it. Just as we see that Jacob will be grieved about it when he's told. But we see right here, it says that he was brought into Egypt. So, he goes into the land of Egypt, and, he's pretty much being sold by the Ishmaelites for, pretty much a greater amount than what, they purchased him from his brethren for. He's basically on auction. Like, they're on auction, like, and it's kind of like, oh, well, pick this one here. He's young. He's got a good back, and stuff like that. That's how they were towards it, and this was cruel, wrong stuff that, happened in those days, and it was just stuff that his brethren shouldn't have told him. Basically his brethren shouldn't have sold him into slavery. And just that this stuff went on, and this stuff's been going on for a long time in these days, and but something that's noteworthy is, pretty much, again, a lot of good comes from what happens to Joseph and his story. But we're going to read here verse 30, Genesis chapter 37, verse 30. And he returned unto his brethren and said, the child is not, and I, whither shall I go? So he's just very regretful of it. And, we see that that's the last thing he wanted to see happen, was his brother be sold into slavery or killed or anything like that, because, he's just the most level-headed and remorseful about it out of the whole bunch, that, he was considered of his father, and all the other ones weren't. But that's the story for right here where we are, and you all have a blessed day.